turn, the ships keep coming and coming. There's no way to cover them with smoke screens. It had an immediate effect. More and more often ships in the sea canal began to fall under artillery fire. We had to press Rear Admiral, aye. Gren. Ivan Ivanovich, please understand, please, there is no one to put smoke screens anymore. Aviation cannot always in our situation quickly depart. All hope is in your batteries. Push harder. Gren objected angrily. I report to you every day about the destroyed batteries of the Nazis. What more is required? But someone is still shooting at our transports. That's what I'm talking about. Gren, of course, understood the seriousness of the situation, was nervous, but quickly withdrew. Let's go to Menshutkin's battery today, he told me once. There on the spot it will be clear to you how we ensure the passage of ships. I gladly agreed. It was our excellent battery. It stood on the northern shore of the bay, in a cosy dacha settlement near Lakta Station, on a railway line specially built by the fleet. 120mm naval guns almost daily fired at the enemy batteries in the Strelna area, shelling our ships. The Germans did not have radar at that time, so at night they could detect our ships only by searchlights. Our battery immediately opened fire on the searchlight and in just a few minutes extinguished it. Amazing accuracy of firing of the Lakta battery amazed us more than once. It was camouflaged perfectly, and even at close range we could not immediately recognize its guns. The battery was commanded by Senior Lieutenant G. Menshutkin, a modest officer drafted from the reserve, formerly a graduate student of the Leningrad Forestry Academy. General erudition and higher education allowed him to quickly master the rules of firing. But this did not satisfy the combatant, and when solving any artillery problem, he took the initiative, evaluating all the results from a scientific point of view. How do you shoot? I asked him. Not particularly well, he suddenly answers. We cover the targets, but not with the first salvo, but with the third. That's great. Inserts Rear Admiral Gren. That's right, but the shells you give us little. All of them on the account, calmly continues the commander. So we decided to hit with the first shot. Without waiting for our further questions, Menshutkin reported that he has long sought to establish why not the first salvo hit the target. Together with his assistants, the commander persistently checked all calculations, but they were correct. The reason was a certain drop in the initial velocity of the projectile due to wear of the barrel channel. Menshutkin had a good command of mathematics and quickly compiled a table of corrections for his guns. This had, of course, a good effect. In the future, the Lakta battery, with few exceptions, covered the target really from the first salvo. About the counter-battery fight in those days talked on the radio and wrote in the newspapers often. But many people had a simplified notion about this fight. We say shoot at the enemy battery, and it shoots at ours, as if it were an artillery duel. Unfortunately, this is how the counter-battery fight is often written about in our literature, and only the artillerymen know that in reality it is not like that at all. They remember how much persistence, skill and courage was required from the commanders of divisions and batteries, from all the soldiers of gun crews to silence the enemy guns, and thus save the lives of many Leningraders. The counter-battery struggle began on September 4th, as soon as the Nazis began to bombard the city. A special artillery group was created to fight their batteries. It included batteries of the army, fleet and guns of ships. Led this firepower commander of Artillery Front Major General V.P. Sviridov and Chief of Artillery Fleet Rear Admiral I. Gren. First of all, it was necessary to organize a network of correction posts. The first of them appeared on the large building of the Kirov District Council, on the building of the Palace of Soviets, and on the meat packing plant behind the Moskovskaya Zastava, as well as on other tall buildings. However, in Leningrad's fall weather, and from these tall buildings the shell bursts were often not visible. After all, we had to hit individual guns. While the enemy fired just at the huge area of Leningrad, he knew that he would still hit the city and harm it. The Nazi batteries were mostly mobile, often changing their positions. Before shooting at them, it was necessary to determine their exact location. And at first our batteries, opening return fire, sometimes had to fire on the area, that is, on the area where the enemy battery was to be located. But to destroy the fascist guns by this method required a large number of shells. There were times when the fascists would stop firing, and we were just starting. Many times the artillerymen of the army and navy gathered to think together about how to increase the effectiveness of counter-battery warfare. In many ways we were helped then by the most experienced artilleryman of our army, Colonel General, now Chief Marshal of Artillery N. Voronov, who arrived in Leningrad as a representative of the Stavka. Observation of the enemy, detailed analysis of his actions helped our artillerymen to learn to determine quite accurately the so-called duty batteries of the enemy. Methods of instrumental reconnaissance of batteries and their aerial photography were widely used. By the end of 1941, we had already achieved great success. Barely the enemy opened fire on the city, as several of our batteries immediately dropped their blows on the pre-selected duty batteries, and then conducted a methodical fire for 20 minutes. The enemy would fall silent. If earlier enemy fire raids lasted a total of up to 4 hours a day, now they were reduced to 15 to 20 minutes. In clear weather, the Germans hardly fired any more. They chose mainly periods of poor visibility and made barrage fire attacks. The specific weight of naval artillery in the counter-battery fight of the front was growing every day. From the fleet attracted up to 321 guns of caliber, from 120 to 406 millimeters. In September, the fleet accounted for 50% of all counter-battery firing at the front, and in November it already accounted for 80%. The need to save shells required strict centralization of fire control of the entire front and fleet artillery. This often delayed the opening of fire. Understand, complained to me Major General I.N. Dmitriev, one of the most experienced coastal defense artillerymen. While we are calling, reporting and clarifying, the enemy may slip away. Some adjustments in artillery management were made later on. Soon Leningrad in the counter-battery fight began not to defend, but to attack. This concept did not coexist well with the idea of batteries without wheels and guns on ships frozen in ice. However, we had batteries on wheels that could move. Having studied the enemy's firing order, our artillerymen quite often determined which German batteries should fire today and prepared in advance for a response. We came once in December with military commander Matushkin to the battery of the Nevsky sector. We found the artillerymen at their battle stations at the guns. The officers were at the command post. I asked, "What's the matter?" A young junior lieutenant with a smile answered, "Waiting for a call from the Nazis." I did not understand, but at the command post of the battery explained to me. As soon as the first shell bursts in the city, we all open fire on the batteries of the fascists, which we are wards, and they fall silent. And indeed, a few minutes later we heard the distant sound of a shell bursting. In another minute, a signal by telephone from the command post of the chief of artillery of the fleet, and at once the guns began to speak, as if a pack of hounds were let down on the discovered beast. The rumble was unbelievable. What were the results? In the combat log of the 768th German Heavy Artillery Division captured by us later, it was written after the second shot of the second battery, there was a return fire of the Russians. As a result of 2 direct hits, the 71 shells and 46 charges exploded. The turntable mechanism of 3 guns was damaged, of course. This battery of fascists had not fired on the city for several days. In their letters, which did not reach their homeland, many Hitler's soldiers wrote naval artillery is the purest hell. As for our mobile railroad batteries scattered all over the Leningrad front, some of them were subordinated to army and some to sea chiefs. There was no unified command of this powerful firepower to defeat the enemy at first. And quite rightly did the military council of the fleet, achieving the creation of a unified, very powerful artillery connection of the fleet. The unification of all railroad batteries in the same hands increased artillery culture, provided a rapid exchange of combat experience, the unity of all methods of solving complex combat problems. On February 22, 1942, the 101st Naval Brigade of Railway Artillery was formed. It consisted of 12 railroad batteries of the fleet and 16 batteries taken from the army. In total, thus, the brigade had 28 railway batteries with guns of 120 to 180 mm caliber, as well as an armoured train Boltiats. Major General I.N. Dmitriev, former commandant of the coastal defence of Hanko, was appointed commander of the brigade. A calm, always judicious artilleryman, he was in love with his brigade, showed a lot of reasonable persistence in its formation, and immediately began active combat operations. The commissar of the brigade was Regimental Commissar G. Yaishnikov, who did much to unite the personnel. This new unit became a part of the Leningrad naval base, and soon after its formation I arrived at the headquarters of the brigade, which was located in railroad cars on the outskirts of the city, somewhere behind the Alexander Nevsky Lavra. The wagons had not yet had time to settle down, they were cold and had little light. It was pleasant to meet many artillerymen who had already gained combat experience on Hanko, comrades Kobets, Granin, Tudor and others. Now some of them were taking divisions, others were organising the service of the brigade headquarters. The excellent officer staff of the brigade justified itself in the shortest possible time. I had not seen its commander I.N. Dmitriev for a long time, perhaps since the beginning of the war. He has not changed much. The same businesslike manner, modesty and parsimony in words. The commander immediately began to report to me about his operational intentions. "We must attack the Nazis, not just shoot back," he said with fervour, explaining on the map his plan. The essence of the plan was that a heavy battery in the dark time quickly enters the firing position, makes a powerful fire attack, and just as quickly leaves. In retelling all this is not difficult, but for such firing it is necessary to make a binding of guns in advance, that is, to know their coordinates precisely, to create several railroad firing positions, so that the enemy did not know in advance from which of them the battery would fire. All this had to be done during the day under enemy fire in order to ensure a stealthy night raid. The transporter, with its supply cars and steam locomotive, is a bulky and heavy structure, requiring, above all, good tracks. Special railroad branches were urgently built around the city. Many times the artillerymen of the brigade fired on airfields, railroad junctions and concentrations of enemy troops. The most important point of supply of the 18th German Army was Gatchina Railroad Junction. Here Hitlerites equipped several airfields. Our intelligence closely followed this area. One day it found out that a lot of railroad echelons were piled up at the station. The target was tempting, but our guns could not reach it from the usual positions. The distance exceeded 40 kilometers. Nevertheless, 180mm battery, no, 19, commanded by Major Mesnyankin, was ordered to make a firing raid on the railroad junction. 7 new firing positions were prepared in the area of the meat-packing plant. Transporters were brought here unnoticed by the enemy. At night shells fell on the enemy station. The attack was so unexpected and powerful that Hitlerites did not manage to steal a single train. Echelons were broken, burned, turned into a mountain of iron. On the 19th battery, Hitlerites could not make a single shot, as their guns were all the time under the fire of our 2 supporting batteries. Later, having applied the same tactic, our artillerymen destroyed almost all airplanes on the airfields of Gatchina. Quickly shoot off, and escape this was very important. Artillerymen of the brigade overlapped all norms when changing firing positions. It was necessary to get ahead of the enemy, so that his shells, which he was aiming at our battery, fell on an empty place. The battery steam locomotive drivers proved to be excellent masters of their craft. By quick and clear manoeuvring they put the transporters in time to firing positions, and after the end of firing quickly took them to cover. I remember that Vasily Andreevich Shmakalov was especially dashing. He is still the best machinist of the Oktyabrskaya Railroad. Our batteries did not always wait for the enemy to open fire. It happened so that, having established by reconnaissance the location of enemy batteries, our artillerymen concertedly and unexpectedly rained shells on the enemy, destroying their batteries to the ground. This was especially important during the passage of convoys along the canal. A special signal was developed for all the artillery of the Army and Navy. At this signal all our batteries, armoured trains, ships and forts of the fleet, as well as Army batteries opened fire. Thus, on the night of January 1st, we congratulated the enemy on the new year of 1942. According to the reports of partisans and air reconnaissance, our artillerymen were hitting accurately. Some of the German batteries were completely destroyed, some were put out of action and could not fire on the city for a long time. The counter-battery struggle continued until the defeat of the Nazis at Leningrad, and it is difficult to say who here defended and who attacked. The fascist artillery was especially furious from November 3rd to 7, immediately opening a barrage of fire on any ship that poked its nose out of Leningrad or Kronstadt. And no matter how we smoked the fairway, no matter how we smashed fascist batteries, the enemy still managed to sink 3 small transports, a tugboat and 2 barges wiped out by ice. Fortunately, the crews were saved. The ships were travelling without troops. They sank outside the sea canal. The captains had time to take them out of the fairway. The siege. The majestic city grew darker every day. In mid-November, the lights went out in the houses. There was not enough electricity. Almost all the power stations stood without fuel. In December, the streetcars and trolleybuses started running. If they had simply not left the parks early in the morning to take the line, it would have been easier. But in the middle of the day, they sluggishly stopped on the line and never moved again. And then shell splinters broke the wires. Explosions destroyed the tracks. Carriages with broken windows froze on turns, on switches, on squares. The blizzard covered them with snowdrifts, and these frozen cars seemed like untidy corpses. It was a snowy winter. On Nevsky Prospect, the sidewalks were no longer visible. Along the houses there were paths that climbed up snowy hills and then steeply descended from them. The city went under the snow. Its wounds were covered with a white veil. In January 1942, water supply, sewerage, heating stopped working in the houses. On the Neva River at the ice holes queued up for water, and the frost exceeded 30 degrees. The last food supplies were melting. In all warehouses they collected everything that could be used for food, down to the flour dust at the mills. Everywhere and the remains of fuel were picked up. It was needed by the factories that made weapons for the front. All railroads leading to Leningrad were cut by the enemy. It was possible to deliver food to the blockaded city only through Lake Ladoga. Frosts struck early in early November. Ladoga was freezing fast, but to lay the ice route it was necessary to collect accurate data on the thickness and strength of ice on the lake. The Military Council of the Lenfront assigned this task to the Baltic Fleet. Vice Admiral V.F. Tributes probably remembered my stories about how I was laying roads on the ice of the Gulf of Finland to the rebellious Kronstadt forts in the winter of 1921. He summoned me to the fleet headquarters and proposed to leave immediately for Ladoga, to Osanovitz, to check on the spot how the ice reconnaissance was going. On Osanovitz Cape, 5 kilometers south of the lighthouse, there was a naval battery of 130mm caliber. It reliably covered the entrance to the Neva from the lake and the whole coast within the range of its fire. The battery was perfectly equipped, its command post and all gun yards had reliable protection. This was also the case with the other batteries that were part of Major Turoverov's division, a caring commander, an artilleryman who loved his work. I often visited his batteries and always relaxed there, seeing the military order, friendly and cheerful faces of soldiers and officers. Here, at the command post of Major Turoverov on November 15th, my first meeting with the hydrographer of the Ladoga military flotilla, Lieutenant E.P.O. Churov, took place. P. Churov. He, then still a very young officer, was entrusted to form a hydrographic detachment and to carry out ice reconnaissance of the lake. The decision to lay a road through Ladoga depended on the results of this work. The conversation with Churov convinced me that I was dealing with a smart, educated officer who would do everything to fulfill the task. To match him were his assistants who arrived from Leningrad, Senior Lieutenant V. Kupryushin and Lieutenants V. N. Dmitriev and S. V. Duyev. V. Duyev. The hydrographers had a team of 10 sailors at their disposal. Everyone was cheerful, worked in friendship and quickly. 5 Finnish sledges were prepared. A compass was installed on them. Milestones, peshny and skis were laid. Lieutenant Churov had already flown around the lake on a U-2 airplane with pilot Topolov. It turned out that the ice edge is still quite close to the Schlisselburg Bay and passes approximately along the parallel of Cape Moria. Churov reported to me at the map. Along the planned route the ice is still very thin. There is almost no snow on it, so the expedition will have to walk most of the way. But the ice is likely to get stronger quickly, as the temperature is expected to drop to 20 degrees. I demanded from hydrographers to be careful. The path of the expedition is only a few kilometers from the enemy. Enemy sentries can go out on the ice and capture our scouts. At dusk, the hydrographers set out on their way. Their departure was reported to Kobona on the opposite eastern shore of the lake. Later, Churov told. We went down on the ice, around darkness. The sky was covered with clouds, you couldn't see a thing. We tied up in pairs with a signal halyard and walked at a distance of 20 meters from each other. In front, with a compass on a sledge, I step. Behind me, Lieutenant Dmitriev marks the distance travelled with a circular. We are listening so as not to come across enemy sentries. Only once in a while we carefully light up the compass with a flashlight. On the right we could see gun flashes, the rumble of artillery firing. Sometimes we could hear the crackle of machine guns very close. In the side moved our combat guard, 3 sailors. The senior of them, Korolev, went on skis with a pedometer. Every 500 to 600 meters we made a hole, measured the ice thickness, and put a milestone. During the night the frost intensified. So, the ice will be stronger, we rejoiced. But suddenly the ice under our feet began to ripple smoothly. We stopped. We measured the thickness of the ice and aghast, only 5 centimeters. So we could go to the bottom. The whole operation could fail. We moved on even more cautiously. The ice seemed to be stable. We went faster, and suddenly again under our feet dead ripples. We walked like that for 5 hours and decided to have a rest. We made a small break, shared the food we had taken with us. Each of us had 800 grams of salted cod, 250 grams of bread and 3 pieces of sugar. In the meantime, the thick clouds parted and the polar star flashed in the night sky. It became more cheerful. By the star, we immediately determined the deviation of the compass. To my horror, it reached 40 degrees. With such a compass, and in the clutches of the enemy can fall. We decided to wait for dawn. The frost was getting stronger and stronger, penetrating to the very bones. And when the sun rose not far to the north, the lighthouse on Ossinovitz Cape was clearly outlined in the dawn haze. It meant that our expedition had been wandering on the ice all night and had gone only 5 miles from the shore. The hydrographers wanted to continue the way, but Lieutenant Dmitriev injured his leg in the ice. They put him on a sledge and turned to the lighthouse. But soon they had to stop. The road was blocked by coastal hummocks. Churov handed over the sledge with all the equipment to the sailors, and he took Dmitriev on his back and carried him 2 kilometers through the hummocks to the dugout on the shore near the lighthouse. Early in the morning we were suddenly informed at the command post that Lieutenant Dmitriev had been taken to the sanitary unit. Which one? What's wrong with him? While we were figuring it out, Churov was gone. Having checked his calculations again and replenished his meager food supplies, he set off again. This time everything turned out safely. By the morning of November 17th, the route through Ladoga was laid. It was marked with milestones and the ice thickness was plotted on a tablet. The next day, in spite of fatigue, our hydrographers carried the first 2 carts with bread from Kobona to the western shore of the lake. So at once they began to equip the route with acetylene lanterns and flashers. After our report on the results of the reconnaissance, the Military Council of the Len Front made a decision to equip a motor road across the lake on November 19th. The work was started immediately. At the same time, the Leningrad Naval Base was forming a ski boat squad for Ladoga Lake. It included 75 sailors. Almost all of them were volunteers, former Leningrad sportsmen sailors. The detachment was headed by a well-known Yoksman Lieutenant I.I. Smetanin. Its headquarters was located in the village of Kokorivo. 19 boyars arrived to Ladoga when there was still thin but good ice on the lake, and immediately joined the combat work. They carried out patrol and reconnaissance service on the flank, guarded the first carts and convoys on the lake, monitored the ice road, warning the vehicles about large scour holes found on the road. Buers saved the lives of hundreds of people, transporting the wounded and sick across the lake in just 30 minutes. They delivered fuel to many cars stuck in snowdrifts. Nazi planes were hunting them, pouring machine gun fire on them. Maneuverability and great speed saved ice-sailing ships easily reached 100 kilometers per hour. At that time, the commanders of Boise I. Lotkin, A. Mikhailov, VK Koshigin, K. I. Alexandrov and many others distinguished themselves in the fighting. The Buer-skiing detachment was subordinated to the head of the ice military automobile road. As soon as the lake was covered with a thick layer of snow, the Buerists began to ski, continuing to carry out the service of reconnaissance, watch and protection of the road. Road maintenance regiments, labour battalions and anti-aircraft batteries took to the ice to cover the road from air raids. Regulators, modest heroines of the Ladoga Highway, took their posts at their ice tents. On the night of November 22nd, in the frost, in a blizzard, the first 60 trucks went from Leningrad to Kobona for food. The ice was cracking under the wheels. Its thickness did not exceed 14 centimetres, but the road of life was in operation. The news travelled all over the city. Now I was no longer asked when we would break the blockade, but more often asked questions: how are things on the road? How does it work? Much has been written about the Ladoga Ice Road, which played such an important role in the heroic defence of Leningrad. But it is a pity that nothing has been said about the first scouts of the lake route, about its pioneers, Baltic hydrographers and drillers. Glorious feats of naval pilots, in particular of the 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, are poorly reflected in the literature. Covering the road from the air from fascist aviation, our pilots sent more than one enemy bomber under the ice. Marine batteries of Major Turoverov's division, located in the area of Osenovets Cape, reliably guarded the road of life. The population of the city was starving. We had to mobilize all our internal resources, and of course they were still there. At the end of December, I was summoned to the Krunstein Channel by the Chief of the Rear of the Fleet, General M.I. Moskalenko. In his small office, in a building that had once been a Tsarist marine prison, I met the Fleet Aviation Commander, Lieutenant General M.I. Samokin, Vice Admiral V.P. Drozd, Lieutenant General A. B. Eliseev, Rear Admiral I. Gren and Captain 2nd Rankav Tripolsky, our new commander of the submarine brigade. They argued animatedly. It was about the fact that the Baltic fleet must surrender all surplus food and fuel to the common pot of Leningrad. General Moskalenko put an end to the arguments. We are obliged to help the Leningraders. Talk to your people, figure out what you can give to the city. Looking ahead, I will say that in December the fleet allocated 1,545 tons of flour, 100 tons of fats, 105 tons of sugar, 3,242 tons of various other products, and 3,000 litres of vodka for the needs of the Leningrad population. This was a serious help at the most critical moment. The situation with fuel was also catastrophic. Due to the lack of it, power plants, transport, defence industry enterprises were stopped. Referring to the decision of the Military Council of the Front, Moskalenko said that he would not give more fuel to many ships at all, and some of them would also take away the excess. He counted something with a pencil in his hands, sometimes looked questioningly at Colonel Smorodkin, the head of the fuel department of the front rear, who was standing aside, checked the figures again and announced to whom and what he would give, from whom and how much he would take away. Everyone understood in their hearts that it was pointless to argue about it, but everyone wanted to convince that it was his unit that should definitely add fuel oil, and not take away the latter. When the passions began to cool down a little, I made one last attack. Mitrofan Ivanovich, my ships are on the front line in the upper reaches of the Neva. The icebreaker will not approach them. If no fuel is supplied, the ships will stop firing and freeze. The general interrupted me with his bass voice. Save fuel in everything. Insulate the decks and entrance hatches, seal the men, turn off all unnecessary warmers. And you will shoot, don't talk nonsense. He finished angrily. And Mitrofan Ivanovich was right. We explained to the fleet personnel the necessity of creating a common cauldron under the blockade. And the sailors understood it. Indeed, we had to compact the crews in the rooms, build good vestibules at the entrance doors and hatches. Even the decks were covered with planks. Our mechanical engineers, with Flag Officer Gorokov at the helm, came up with a lot of useful things to save fuel. Groups of ships, in particular, received heat from special heaters. As a result, the fleet allocated to the industry of the city 6,298 tons of fuel oil, 465 tons of solar, and a large amount of gasoline, kerosene and lubricating oils. Yet the Navy was not without fuel. The ships lived and fired. While we were arguing about who should take more and who should take less, our fleet lunch hour came. The meal is served, exactly at noon, the matron girl reported, and the general invited all of us to the dining room. Traditional hospitality in the fleet was preserved throughout the blockade during its hungriest days. Wherever I was, whether on a gunboat, on a cruiser, or on the smallest battery, we were always cordially invited to the table at the usual hour. It was impossible to refuse. The hosts persistently shared with the guest the last piece of bread, the last plate of liquid muddy soup. And what was especially touching, in all wardrooms of ships and in coastal units strictly observed the traditional order of serving the table regardless of the quality and quantity of blockade dishes. Thus, on the cruiser Kirov. At the set time, 4 young sailors' messengers in full white uniform arranged on the snow-white tablecloth, with starched napkins the devices of the beautiful Navy service, plates for bread and snacks, stands for knife and fork, faceted decanters with water and large glasses to them, elegant vessels and vases for fruit, sugar bowls and oil cans. Most of these items, understandably, were not needed at all for the blockade dinner, but stood in their place, as they had done for decades. And as always, the ship's senior assistant commander solemnly pronounced, "Comrades, commanders, please come to the table without his invitation." No one sat down to the table and dinner did not begin. This convention reflected the strength of traditions, tightness and organization of the Navy life, even in the harsh conditions of war, even when the alarm at any moment could force people to scatter to battle stations. We went up to the second floor to a small room with a single window overlooking the canal. The general whispered something to the waitress. We realized that the hostess had been asked to make 8 servings out of 4. There were no additional rations for generals or admirals during the blockade. The ration was one for everyone, and yet the table shone with crystal and porcelain, but alas, without contents. A lively conversation continued at the table. Each tried to bargain something else from the rear chief for his compound. The soup was poured, but no sooner were we done with it than the radio announced the beginning of shelling of the area and suggested that everyone take shelter in the shelter. Everyone heard the loud voice of the announcer, the alarm, and behind the wall, the stomping of the feet of hundreds of people going down to the shelter. But no one at the table raised an eyebrow. We went on with our meal. And yet, "Mitrofan Ivanovich, you give me more fuel, VP." Drozd was getting hot. We did not hear the answer. The house shuddered. A heavy shell exploded not far away, somewhere on Labour Square. Then almost immediately there was a huge explosion in the courtyard, and another shell flew into a large apartment house on the canal embankment, right against the room where we were dining. There was the ringing of shattered window panes, the rattle of the bricks of the collapsing building. A cloud of dust rose above it, fringed with flames. Plaster sprinkled on the table in our room. Shards of glass flew at us. A lamp flew from the ceiling. We jumped up, shaking off the dust and shards. At that moment, the rear military commander MS Rodionov rushed into the room in a work uniform and with a gas mask on his side. Always calm and affable, this time he seemed to be burning with the fire of the fire, and even at the door excitedly but clearly said, "Comrades, admirals and generals." What an outrage. After all, the alarm was announced. The commissar, of course, was right. To the delight of the enemy could easily die 8 top commanders of the fleet if the shell in the yard fell a few dozen meters to the left. Jokingly trying to hide our embarrassment, we parted ways. The sorrows of blockade days were brightened by human friendship. Everyone around became somehow softer and more attentive to each other. Everyone tried to share what he could to fulfill a request, if there was any opportunity. And, what was especially valuable, it was done sincerely. From the heart, without pretenses for any compensation or gratitude. On New Year's Eve, many children's institutions and infirmaries appealed to the nearest ships standing on the Neva. They also called us, to the headquarters and political department of the base, with a request to get them a Christmas tree. It was a problem then. It was strictly forbidden to cut down trees in gardens and parks, and few forests were in the frontline zone. And yet, of course, we got Christmas trees for children and hospitals. Even a big children's matinee with Santa Claus and a concert for children was organized in the theatre of musical comedy. What to speak of children? We had a Christmas tree in every barracks on every warship. Nobody wanted to give up this tradition. New Year's concerts took place everywhere. Ship commanders congratulated their men with the new year. I met 1942 at the Christmas tree at the fighters' Christmas tree on the Bangor floating base. Musical comedy artists gave us a wonderful concert. Exactly at 00:00 on January 1st, all ships of the detachment gave a powerful salvo from all guns on fascist troops of the front line. Many sad, and sometimes tragicomic episodes depicting the life of Leningraders during the blockade remained in the memory of its witnesses. For example, one day the wife of my friend, who together with his unit was outside Leningrad, came to see me. The family was starving. To my great sorrow, I could not help her. The woman looked at my big old pigskin briefcase. "Can't you give it to me?" she asked me, embarrassed. I, of course, gave the briefcase, though I didn't immediately realize what my friend's wife needed it for. A few days later, I received a small piece of quite edible jelly in a box. The nickel-plated parts of the briefcase were attached to it separately, as if to prove that they had not become components of the blockade dish. Good battle friendship firmly cemented the whole big family of Baltic sailors' superiors and subordinates. The attentive attitude of sailors to officers was striking. Any order or request they tried to fulfill as best and fast as possible. Letters, telegrams and greetings full of love and admiration were sent to the besieged Leningrad from all parts of the great land. All measures were taken to increase food supplies via Lake Ladoga and by air. The whole country sent us parcels and food gifts. The inhabitants of Primorsky Krai collected and sent from Vladivostok to Leningrad a whole echelon 900 tons of food and other gifts. Members of the delegation visited our pilots, submariners and artillerymen, visited the Kronstadt fortress. On the day of the Soviet Army and Navy, February 23, 1942, I received a silver cigarette case with the inscription from the workers of Primorsky Krai to the heroic defender of Leningrad. 10 years later, being already the commander of the Pacific Fleet, at a dinner among friends I took out this cigarette case, which I kept as the most precious relic, and offered my neighbor a cigarette. It was also on the day of the Soviet Army and Navy. And suddenly my neighbor, the chairman of Primorsky Krai Executive Committee D, Amyashkin, recognizing the cigarette case, exclaimed, "These cigarette cases we bought at the expense of the workers of the region. I myself sent them to Leningrad in the 41st year." My blockade cigarette case became the hero of the evening, and I had to remember the past once again and warmly thank primary people for their brotherly care in those unforgettable days. Ski track found. With these words almost ran into my office Chief of Staff Rear Admiral V.A. Petrovsky. "What's the matter? What ski track? Where?" I was surprised. "Look," continued anxiously Rear Admiral, opened a working map in front of me. "This afternoon our first ski patrol, having reached the Kamenia Bank, went to the Sea Canal and found here 2 fresh tracks going straight to Peterhof. It is quite obvious that the enemy scouts were approaching the canal. There was something to think about. Only a week ago, on November 13th, the Nevskaya Bay was covered with ice. There was almost no snow on it, only slightly powdered, and the Nazis were already on skis. With the freezing of the bay, a new front was formed, an ice front. Its length was not less than 50 kilometers. Its defense, of course, required special forces and means. Already on the second day after the Neva and the bay became frozen, the Military Council of the Lenfront made a decision to create a special organization, the internal defense of the city. It included detachments of the city militia, fire brigades, rifle work brigades, as well as parts of the Leningrad naval base, in total up to 37,000 fighters. The city was divided into 6 sectors of defense. The entire ice strip adjacent directly to the city was included in the 7th sector. For its defense were responsible troops of the inner defense of the city, including ships and parts of the naval base. The most important task of the base was the defense of the Sea Canal fairway from Leningrad to Peterhof. The forces allocated for the inner and ice defense of the city were commanded by the head of the garrison, Lieutenant General G.A. Stepanov, an experienced border guard and an excellent organizer. I was appointed his deputy in the marine part. "You are in command here, Admiral, although the sea is frozen, but still it is not land," joked the general when we made a plan with him for the winter internal defence of Leningrad. Indeed, the ice front had its own peculiarities. Winter was fierce from the very first days. It was impossible to keep troops on the ice. It was impossible to build dugouts or trenches for them. Therefore, timely ice reconnaissance of approaches to the city from the seaside, through the ice, was of special importance. We sent out patrols on the ice no more than 3 kilometers from the city, and the sea canal was obliged to guard up to Peterhof. This exceeded 9 to 10 kilometers. Driving around the units assigned for actions on the ice, we often had a bad word for our Osoviakim and physical culture organizations of the country. How little attention they paid to mass ski training of young people before the war. We did not need champions, but just skiers who could walk firmly and confidently on the snow. There were few such among our fighters. All our hastily formed ski battalions were at first just training units, and the enemy was already in full swing walking on ice on skis. Major Frolov, the flagship head of physical training of the base's units, was training skiers day and night. There was little snow on the ice. The bay, only sprinkled with snow in some places, looked like a mirror. Strong squalls were literally blowing away our skiers. We were selecting fighters who had already mastered skiing a little bit and formed squads from them. We were looking for skiers from all the other units in the fleet. Probably to play soccer, so dozens of teams would have found, but with skiing badly lamented Major Frolov. The claim is fair. A Soviet young man, the defender of our motherland, should be able to shoot, swim and ski even before being drafted into the army. The news that an enemy ski track had been discovered on the bay immediately travelled to all command authorities. Each headquarters was interested in the details from its own point of view. For example, the headquarters of the 21st Infantry Division, which was defending the space between the dam of the sea canal and the shore, was interested in whether the direction of the track was accurately determined, whether there was not another trail in the direction from west to east. A number of other, also very important questions were raised by the fleet headquarters. Our communication with it was now much simplified. According to the decision of the Military Council of the Front, it relocated to Leningrad and occupied the premises of the headquarters of the Leningrad naval base. We moved to the right wing of the Admiralty, overlooking both the Neva and the Palace Passage. In a few days we managed to equip a small command post in the basement and, most importantly, to ensure communication with all parts of the base, with Kronstadt and with the headquarters of the fleet and the front. This was, of course, a great merit of communicators Schwarzberg, Utrobin, and all their subordinates. It was not so easy to do it in 4 or 5 days. Yuri Alexandrovich, was the track itself sharply visible? Wasn't the snow crumpled all around? And how close was it to the canal? After all, the enemy is not in vain looking at the frozen canal. Interrogated on the phone Chief of Staff of the Fleet Yoif Rawl. For a detailed questioning of our sentries were called to the headquarters. We did not learn any special details from them. The fierce cold, pitch darkness, the wind does not give a move, all dragged to the side. They reported in unison. Well, it's clear I interrupt the fighters, but still, what did you see around the track in the snow? Both skiers were on such a patrol, and in such a situation for the first time in their lives, and to their embarrassment they did not see the details we needed. Continuous observation of the canal along its entire length was still beyond our power at that time. And here, in the most difficult period for skiers, before the establishment of a dense snow cover on the whole ice, we were firmly helped by sports buoys. Nobody thought that these ice yachts could serve as a combat service. One squad of 18 Bieres was part of the base's water area protection forces. Another squad of 19 Bieres was part of the Air Defence Corps. Buoys could carry hand machine guns, but we were especially satisfied with their high speed, which exceeded, as I have already said, 100 kilometers per hour. This made them invulnerable to the enemy. They could not travel on thick and caked snow that was their disadvantage. But at the beginning of the harsh winter the ice was almost clear, so the Bieres immediately began to reconnoitre the area of the sea canal and the entire ice front. They also kept in touch with 4 barges of air defence, frozen in the ice of the Neva Bay. The teams of buoyers were manned by Leningrad yachtsmen, among them Senior Lieutenant I. P. Matviev, our famous sailing sailors Senior Lieutenant N.G. Shepkin, Junior Lieutenant BPD, Dmitriev and others. The commander of the detachment I. P. Matviev, performing combat missions, often under enemy shrapnel fire, flew on the ice of the bay, as if on the distance of the next all-Union competitions. Our winter-flying Dutchmen delivered food to air defence barges, made ice reconnaissance, and probably the help rendered by I. P. Matviev to the defence. P. Matviev to the defence of the bay was the greatest achievement in his great sporting life. Other sportsman buyers, petty officers of the first Article A. N. Matskevich and MMA Sorochenkov also acted bravely. The next day after the ski track was discovered, at dawn on November 22nd, we released our scouts bureauists. In a few tens of minutes they flew around the area, which skiers would hardly go around for the whole day. From the buoy of Senior Lieutenant N.G. Shepkin near the route of the Sea Canal, against Peterhof, our scouts found an observation post of the enemy, arranged in the deckhouse of a sunken tugboat. About 10 Hitlerites were swarming on the ice near the deckhouse, installing an antenna, flying like a whirlwind. Shooting buoys stunned them. The Nazis scattered and hid in the hummocks without even firing a shot. A few minutes later, as soon as we received the reports of the buoys, our Lahti battery immediately opened fire. The whole superstructure of the ship was completely destroyed. Secondly sent buoy reported that mutilated corpses of enemy soldiers scattered far from the sunken tugboat. Combatman Shutkin kept his word to cover the enemy with the first salvo. Reports flew to the headquarters of the inner defence of the city and to the headquarters of the fleet. Only there was talk then, that about buoys and about artillerymen. But the day didn't end with that. Apparently the Germans were going to more deeply probe the entire defence system of our ice route. Quite unexpectedly came a report from Kronstadt that the enemy with a large detachment of infantry and tanks came on the ice from Peterhof in the direction of the Sea Canal. This was also discovered by our patrol boys. It smelled of serious business. All the units of the VOG were alerted. There was no certainty that the Nazis will not fly in other places. Rear Admiral Gren, the master of all the artillery of the fleet, was pleased. "Don't worry," he told me, "the more of them got out on the ice, the better for us. We'll sweep them all away." I left with the commissar of the base A. Matushkin to our battery, which stood on the slope facing the sea of the then unfinished Kirov Stadium. This place was historical. Here, on the spit of Krestovsky Island, stood back in 1855, one of the batteries that defended St. Petersburg from the sea in the days of the Crimean campaign. From here the whole bay was clearly visible. First, our battleship October Revolution opened fire on the fascists, who came out on the ice, and then the batteries ours and Kronstadt's. Very soon the enemy infantry was scattered, half destroyed, and one tank was sunk. Boers that arrived found only snow-covered corpses on the ice. This was the first artillery examination of our winter defences. Artillery of the naval base played a huge role in the winter defence of the city. The whole ice field of the bay was shot from Leningrad and Kronstadt by 200 guns of the most different calibre, from small to 400 3mm. The fire was strictly planned in a very complex system of interaction, for the fleet's guns were not only for the ice section. They were needed for all other sectors of the defence of Leningrad, but the ice front was given a lot of help. Thus, the 2nd Air Defence Corps allocated us 12 anti-aircraft batteries for action on the ice. In addition, 3 divisions of 85mm anti-aircraft guns were deployed for the same purpose in the western part of the city, closer to the coastline on Krestovsky Island, on Vasilyevsky Island and on the Petrograd side. It was a great force, and it seemed to us that there was no way for the enemy to approach the city through the ice through such a veil of fire. I cannot help recalling one very original artillery rationalization. We of course understood that mobile artillery in defence is of great importance, but where to get it? And so our sailor artillerymen mounted 45mm guns on sleds and easily dragged them behind them by hand. This made 8 beautiful self-propelled batteries. This witty invention helped us in the defence of the frozen bay. The snowfalls that had begun threatened to spoil the Boer road. We accelerated the preparation of the ski detachment. On November 23rd, sent-out patrols of skiers did not find any traces of the enemy, but we were not sure that the Nazis did not get to the canal. Meanwhile, on the next day by the canal, under the conduct of 2 icebreakers, was to come to Leningrad detachment of warships with troops. Should we take the risk or refuse to use the canal at all in the first days of winter? But there were still a lot of ships and operational cargoes to be brought to Leningrad, and the transfer of troops from Hanko was to be completed. It was technically impossible to trawl the canal through the ice beforehand. We realized that the enemy could put mines in the canal, dropping them into the holes punched in the ice. These holes were quickly covered with snow. We had to learn how to find them. Of course, our skiers did not grasp this new wisdom of ice warfare at once. They decided not to delay the ships. On November 24th, the icebreaker Volinets left Kronstadt at nightfall, followed by the icebreaker October with the leader Leningrad in tow. Then came the minesweeper Ural and transport Pyataletka, both with the troops of the Hanko garrison. The detachment consisted of very valuable warships, and most importantly, had on board not 1,000 soldiers and commanders. Several batteries of the base were ready to immediately open fire on enemy batteries if they tried to fire on our ships. Time stretches languidly and tediously. The enemy is suspiciously silent and does not even illuminate the caravans going in the ice. The Chief of Artillery, Rear Admiral II. Gren calls me from his command post. Where are our ships? Will we open fire on the enemy? Ships, according to the calculation of time, apparently are approaching the traverse of Peterhof. They are silent, so everything is going normally, I answer, but I myself, and all the commanders at the base command center at this moment, is bad at heart. We request our observation post in the head of the dike of the Sea Canal. He also sees and hears nothing. The atmosphere at the command post is tense. Everyone is talking almost in a whisper. What's the matter? Where are the ships? And then, around 9 p.m., the phone rings. The observation post reports that in the sea clearly heard an explosion. Did you check? Maybe it's the Nazis opened artillery fire on the ships. No. A few minutes later they report 2 more explosions in the same direction, but not so strong. And the ships are silent, so they're coming. Again we ask the post, is the enemy not shining no light? Again languid minutes stretch. Fleet Chief of Staff Rear Admiral YF roll calls, suggests whether it is not exploded mines. And from the observation post the answers are the same, we do not see anything. Only at about 22 o'clock the petty officer excitedly reported we hear some muffled murmurs and as if ice cracking, but nothing is still visible. And at last, joyful news, the lead icebreaker Volinets appeared. It turned out that a mine exploded near the icebreaker in the area of Kamenia Bank, which is against Peterhof, and 8 minutes later 2 more. The mines were apparently either of the river type or simply army land mines. They caused only minor shrapnel damage to the ship. But the fact in itself was alarming. It became clear that the enemy had decided to mine the Sea Canal. We immediately increased the number of patrols on the ice. The Kronstadt men did the same. It was the only possible then, but far from reliable countermeasure. At night in a blizzard it was, of course, difficult to notice the Germans coming out on the ice in white coats, even at the closest distance. In a blizzard I can't even see my partner in 2 or 3 steps, complained the fighters. We could not, of course, set up night patrols along the whole canal. As part of the Leningrad naval base there was also a detachment of icebreakers. It included all the line icebreakers that were in the Baltic at the beginning of the war, including the grandfather of the icebreaker fleet Ermak. All personnel of icebreakers on mobilization remained on their ships. We only supplemented the crews with artillery crews, as well as added signallers and radio operators. Thus, the icebreakers became very strong artillery ships. The crews were diverse in age. On the decks of the ships one could meet an elderly machinist who had served on an icebreaker for a dozen years, and an ageless sailor in his 2nd year of service. But the first fight with the air enemy and with its ground batteries united people into a friendly fighting team. Icebreakers fulfilled the most important combat task provided all our operational transportation along the sea canal and beyond. The detachment was headed by an experienced Baltic sailor, lively, responsive and caring commander, Captain First Rank Fyodor Leontievich Yukovsky. He managed to sensitively approach the old ice captains and quickly gained their trust and respect. The icebreakers did not have combat chopping blocks or any protection from shells and shrapnel, and there was nowhere for the personnel to hide from shelling. Yukovsky, who personally participated in all the most important icebreaker operations and remained on the bridge under enemy fire, set an example of courage and endurance. Although all the damage on the Volinets was quickly repaired, Fyodor Leontievich lamented that we had no means of fighting against mines in the ice. There was only one way out to prevent the enemy from laying mines. Frosts were getting stronger every day, and in the beginning of December reached 25 degrees. The cold was accompanied by stormy blizzards. The icebreaker Volinets could not sail because of heavy ice, and was replaced by the more powerful Ermak. To help him from December 4th, another line icebreaker was included. Of course, we strengthened the ski patrols, and for good reason. Thus, the icebreaker Ermak passed from Leningrad to Kronstadt quite safely. Apparently, there were no mines in the channel. Long, restless winter nights came. We expected, and not without reason, from the enemy all sorts of trickery. On December 6th, 5 miles from the head of the Sea Canal Dam, our sentries discovered 4 fresh ice holes, barely covered with ice. Apparently, our sentries frightened the Germans fleeing. They left 2 Czechs and 2 mine springs near the holes. The sledge tracks led to Peterhof. A mine party was immediately sent to the discovered holes. The miners exploded depth bombs in the holes. It was a new and the only way to fight with mines under the ice. A few Nazi mines exploded, but how many remained and whether they remained at all, it was difficult to judge. When a day later, on December 8th, at about midnight the Ermak approached this area, leading from Kronstadt on a tugboat destroyer Stoichi, ahead of the icebreaker, a little away from the fairway, exploded a mine of great force. A mass of broken ice fell on the ship. Shrapnel killed a sailor, 3 men were wounded, 16 were concussed. The old ship suffered minor deck deformation, but remained in service. It was the explosion of a large magnetic mine of the enemy, placed apparently in a shallow place away from the fairway. On the icebreaker's arrival in the Neva, we immediately went to it. The captain of Ermak M.Y. Sorokin briefly and calmly told us about what had happened, led us around the deck and showed us how the metal pilings more than a fist thick had sagged in the bow room. It's all nothing, he said, but it's a pity about the sailor. The rest of the guys will all be back in the line soon. There are no seriously wounded. How long will it take to repair? I asked. The old captain looked at us in surprise. Let's go even tomorrow. If there is no one to go, transportation will not disrupt. We will repair by our own forces. And indeed, the friendly and experienced crew quickly repaired all the damage, and in a few days Ermak again went to Kronstadt for ships. Reinforcement of our watch service apparently confused the enemy's calculations. The holes began to be detected far from the fairway. Hitlerites on the ice were obviously nervous, hurried and put mines wherever they could. The last mine explosion on the channel that winter occurred on the night of December 12th, when one of the line icebreakers led from Kronstadt, destroyer Svarpi, minesweeper BTCH 210 and submarine Shech 309. In the area of Peterhof ahead of the icebreaker, but significantly away from the course again, heard an explosion. A mass of broken ice flew into the air, and that was the end of the matter. However, the enemy continued his attempts to mine the fairway until the ice was opened. To strengthen the patrols from the middle of December, a special reserve of skiers consisting of 2 companies was created on the head of the dike of the Sea Canal. In the direction of Streltsy and Peterhof began to go out strike and reconnaissance ski groups. The same groups began to send out and Kronstadtsee in their zone. South of the fairway, against Peterhof, we put on the ice infantry minefield. By this time, Rear Admiral Gren had sufficiently scouted the positions of enemy batteries firing on our ships on the section Peterhof-Strelna. The batteries allocated to them immediately opened fire on the enemy's searchlights installed on the shore. Without searchlights, the enemy's fire was almost completely unthreatening to us. Movement along the Sea Canal thus continued almost daily and unimpeded. One day in the middle of December, the Chief of Staff of the fleet urgently summoned me to him and said, "Prepare the best icebreaker. It should take the submarine K-51 out to sea." "And how will she return in winter, Yuri Fedorovich?" I wondered. Chief of Staff explained that the new large cruiser submarine K-51 just enters the fleet and, according to the plan, should all winter to act on enemy communications in the Baltic Sea. She will return to the base in spring, as soon as the ice is gone. The boat was to be led with the icebreaker almost to Gogland. The management of this operation was entrusted to the experienced submariner Captain Second Rank L.A. Kernikov. From the operational point of view, the plan was very interesting. The fascists were shouting all over the world about the destruction of our fleet and blocking its remnants in Leningrad. And at this very time, a Soviet submarine appeared in the Baltic Sea and sank the fascist ships. The idea of the campaign was tempting and consonant with the active behavior of all our forces of the Army and Navy in the defense of Leningrad. Returning from headquarters, I ordered to double the number of patrols along the sea canal. For artillery cover of the submarine passage, the base allocated 5 batteries and the Kronstadt Fortress 7. On December 18th, we saw off the icebreaker and with it the submarine cruiser. The ice in the channel was very heavy, the ships went slowly, and only by 6 o'clock in the morning came to the traverse of Peterhof. The enemy illuminated them with the beams of his 6 searchlights and opened an intense artillery fire, but our batteries silenced the Germans quickly. 3 small caliber shells still hit the icebreaker, did not cause it any serious damage, and the submarine cruiser was not even touched. There were no explosions of ships on mines. The initiative in the struggle for the channel clearly passed into our hands. However, on the passage to Levansari Island, the submarine repeatedly got into a very difficult situation and was significantly damaged by a strong ice movement. On December 27th, not having repaired all her damages, she returned to Kronstadt with the icebreaker Ermak, and unfortunately her departure to the sea was postponed. This small episode with the submarine K-51 could not be recalled, but the idea that gave rise to it well characterized the direction of our then Navy operational thought. The Baltic fleet, by formal geographical factors, was as if in a blockade, but the Baltic were always looking for a chance to damage the enemy at sea, and like the troops of the Leningrad front, kept the offensive initiative in their hands. Thus, all the fall months our submarines were fighting on the enemy's communications throughout the Baltic. They went to sea, and after the entire fleet went to Kronstadt, and under the walls of Leningrad unfolded the most intense and decisive battles. Deployment of our submarines at sea occurred even when the harsh winter was already blowing. Storms that fall were especially fierce in the Baltic. There were accidents on the boats, sometimes damaged horizontal rudders. Sailors repaired the damage in the cold water on stormy nights. And yet, despite all these difficulties, in October and November in the Baltic Sea, at the same time there were up to 7 submarines. Our aviation could not help them, because all of it at that time was operating on the land front in the interests of the defense of Leningrad. Exceptional endurance and heroism showed submariners in these autumn months. Our submarines sailed near the German coasts in the southern Baltic, in the Danzig Bay, and on the communications between Tallinn and Helsinki. They had to force the mine barriers of the Nazis in the Gulf of Finland. For 2 months, according to the reports of the submarine commanders, 7 German transports were sunk by torpedoes of the boats commanded by Captains 3rd Rank F. Ivantsov I. M. Vishnevsky SPP, Isin A.S. Abrosimov and P.D. Grishenko. This does not exhaust the damage inflicted on the enemy that fall by our submariners. In the last days of October and in the beginning of November, the boat S7 shelled Narva, Vivara and Asiri stations in Narva Bay. With the fire of its cannons, it blew up the ammunition stores of the enemy, set fire to large stocks of fuel. The submarine Lembit blocked the Bjorkson Strait with mines. Only the ice that bound the Baltic forced our submarines to return to Kronstadt. The last to return on December 11th, submarine Sheikh 309 under the command of Captain 3rd Rank Cabo. So ended our submariners the first year of the war. Their combat operations began in the conditions of white nights, when each battery charging was a complicated operation that was interrupted more than once. Neither day nor night submarines in the sea had no rest from the enemy's aircraft and anti-submarine ships. In addition, the fascists, brazenly violating international law, almost all their transportation was made in Swedish territorial waters. Captain 3rd Rank F. I. Ivantsov, commander of the boat Shech 323, has repeatedly told us how, when attacked by Nazi transports, those turned away and ran away into Swedish waters, and to meet our submarine flew patrol boats. On the eastern shore of the Baltic and in the Gulf of Riga, the Germans transported their troops and cargoes in the shallowest depths on barges, lighters and pontoons. No submarine at these depths could maneuver underwater. Such was the case with submarines S-101 and S-102 in the Urban Strait, which saw laden shallow draft enemy vessels going under the shore. Obviously, in these cases, strikes on such enemy communications had to be made with other weapons by aviation and light forces. We understood it well, but our abandonment of naval bases and airfields in the Baltic and in the Gulf of Riga prevented this possibility. The actions of our submarines could have been more effective, but everything around was unfolding quite differently from what was planned, as it was supposed to be, and it was happening, as they say, quite the opposite. And yet our submarines in 1941 sunk, according to the reports of commanders, 1 submarine and 10 transports with military cargoes and troops put up about 100 mines barriers, on which the German ships were blown up. The enemy's freedom of navigation in the Baltic was sharply violated. Our submarines forced him to go in convoys with guards. All this complicated the transitions, slowed down the turnover of vehicles of Hitler's fleet. Our transportation through the Sea Canal and any movement of ships in the ice ended by the new year. During November and December 1941, more than 40 ship detachments passed from Kronstadt to Leningrad. They transported for the front more than 22,000 soldiers, 128 guns, 28 tanks, and a lot of ammunition. At the same time, 14615 soldiers, 44 tanks and 22 guns, as well as many thousands of tons of ammunition, food, fuel and other cargoes, were transported from Leningrad to Oranienbaum for the Primorsky operational group of troops. At the same time, there were only 3 cases of explosions on mines of icebreakers, by the way, not out of service. Significant thickening of the ice cover in the Neva Bay posed a new threat to us. The enemy could now go out on the ice, not only with infantry, but also with tanks and artillery to ensure their mine-laying and even to break into the city. This possibility was not excluded, although it became more and more difficult for the Germans to approach the canal undetected. We considerably strengthened the protection of the canal by sentries. Our skiers more than 16 times during the winter, with the fire of automatic rifles, drove away the Germans who were climbing to the canal. Many times it came to hand fighting in the dark. Killed and wounded were on both sides. Hitlerites began to go out on the ice by detachments of 25 to 30 people, probing the whole system of our ice defense. During the winter we had almost no quiet night. It happened, just lie down at the command post to take a Napa phone call. They report from the post on the ice you can hear machine gun fire. At once you wouldn't know whether it was a company or a regiment, or maybe it was an attack on the city. It was like no sleep at all. There's an alarm on the ice front, and so almost every night. Of course, with Ice Age, the possibilities of penetration of fascist spies and saboteurs into the city increased. Our patrols were warned about it. One frosty night in the strongest snowstorm, our watch, headed by Petty Officer Ponomarev, was returning from the bay. In the darkness, the sentries came across several fascist spies who were sneaking from Leningrad. A short firefight ensued. One of the spies immediately fell. Our fighters were unharmed. They immediately searched the dead man and found very important documents with him, which helped to speed up the disclosure of the spy's nest in Leningrad. Unfortunately, darkness and snowstorm did not allow to specify the number of spies. Their traces on the ice were immediately covered with snow. Hitlerites tracked our sentries in every possible way, arranging ambushes in ice hummocks. 2 of our fighters, A. Epikin and N. Vikrov, ran into such an ambush. Although there were more than 10 Germans, the sailors joined the fight, fired to the last cartridge, threw grenades, and when the ammunition ran out, they used knives. The support sent from the dam found the corpses of our soldiers at dawn. Soviet sailors gave their lives not cheaply. Around them lay several Nazi corpses. As soon as the enemy detected the slightest movement of our sentries on the ice or on the dike of the sea canal, his artillery immediately opened fire, with shrapnel mainly from the area of Strelna and Peterhof. It happened that our ski squad had already taken cover behind the dam, and the Nazis were still firing at the empty, silent ice field for another 10 to 15 minutes. During almost the whole winter the Germans often, and for a long time, shelled our battery No. 3 on the southern wall of the head of the Sea Canal Dam and the area where the skiers' dugouts were located. The indiscriminate firing did not bring us much damage, but once, on January 13th, Lieutenant General A.B. Elisiv, commandant of the Kronstadt fortress, anxiously informed me by telephone that the Germans, consisting of at least 2 companies with guns, had just come out on the ice, apparently from Peterhof. We dispersed them with the fire of batteries. "Probably they will come to you too, take measures," warned the general. There's another alarm on the ice front. We deployed additional ski reserves along the canal. From above, incessant phone calls. What's new? How are things? What do you hear? Look, do not miss as if on purpose. All these days raged blizzard. In 2 steps could not see anything. And on January 15th, our reconnaissance found a significant concentration of fascist infantry near the shore near Strelna. Railway 120mm battery from Lachta immediately opened fire. Hitlerites were scattered. Good half of them remained on the ice. The accumulation of enemy infantry on the shore at the end of January near Sestroretsk was also dispersed by the fire of the Kronstadt artillery. The nights were long, there was very little daylight, and frequent blizzards impaired visibility. This increased the tension. In different places on the shore here and there, reinforced enemy detachments with machine guns came out on the ice, but as soon as we detected them, they immediately hid towards the northern or southern shore of the Neva Bay, leaving dead and wounded on the ice. On March 8th, we received another nervous call from Kronstadt. We had received information about an allegedly large offensive across the ice to Leningrad. At the insistence of the commandant of the fortress, the commander of the fleet organized a daily aerial reconnaissance of the coast of Koivistolizy Nose. At the same time, they also took our zone Peterhof Strelna. The pilots flew honestly but found no one. Went there and our reconnaissance ski squads, but with the same results. The general situation in the theatre of war in those days did not foreshadow the possibility of a major offensive, but it was difficult to prove otherwise. Lieutenant General M.I. Samokhin, commander of the Fleet Air Force, called me. "Why are you exhausting my aviation for nothing? After all, fuel must be saved. Where is the enemy?" We spent more than one sleepless night, but we didn't find the attack on the ice. The Germans apparently were trying to reconnoitre or cover the laying of mines in the canal. These attempts continued throughout the winter until the ice began to melt. On April 7th and 8th, our patrols again found fresh holes on the fairway against Peterhof. Again the alarm. Again the alarm. We're sending out a mine party. Several very large magnetic mines were detonated in the holes we discovered. The enemy failed to mine the sea canal in order to interrupt our most important communication between Leningrad and Kronstadt in spring. Summer was approaching, and the fleet was preparing for a new combat campaign. It was necessary not only to repair the ships, but also to prepare people well for the upcoming battles. Combat and political training of the ship's personnel was widely deployed. With great attention, we listened to the Chief of Fleet Intelligence N.S. Frumkin, who reported on the situation in the camp of the enemy. The Finnish press quite transparently hinted at the need for peace. Moreover, the Finns even threatened Hitler with a separate peace if they were not given help with troops and food, and this after only 6 months of war. Later Frumkin told about the meeting in Hitler's headquarters on February 13th, 1942. At it they discussed the destruction of the Baltic fleet in winter in the ice. The German Naval Command proposed for this purpose to conduct continuous attacks on the Russian naval forces in Leningrad and Kronstadt by German army artillery and air forces. The situation was thus once more complicated. The places where our ships were parked were known to the enemy. We could not move them in heavy ice conditions. Strengthening the camouflage and even anti-aircraft cover did not save the ships from artillery fire. It remained only to strengthen the counter-battery fight. spring wind. The fascists fired 7,380 shells at Leningrad in March. Ships received a number of damages. Thus, on March 23rd, the Germans were fiercely firing at the Baltic plant and at the battleship October Revolution standing near the plant. Having all the data about the location of the ships, it was not difficult to shoot at such large areas. Two 152mm heavy shells hit the battleship, one in the radio room, the other in the deck. Damage was minor, but one radio operator was killed in the shelling and 2 were wounded. Significant destruction was in the shops of the plant. Gren, who arrived with me on the battleship, assured that all the enemy batteries firing on the ship were extinguished and partially destroyed. But the commander of the battleship, Rear Admiral Michigan Moskalenko, from this did not become easier. The radio room was destroyed. An excellent radio operator was killed. We examined the place where the shell fell. The deck above the 4th casemate, in which it hit, was only slightly shattered. The battleship was rightly considered the pride of Russian shipbuilding. Its durability was amazing. Over the winter, the Nazis shot at the ships. What could we do? Only one thing: to destroy all enemy batteries as soon as possible, and the best way, of course, by aviation. And we decided with Gren to talk about it with the commander of the Fleet Aviation, Lieutenant General M.I. Samokhin. Mikhail Ivanovich Samokhin told us about the deeds of our pilots. Especially distinguished then the 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. In it, the hero of the Soviet Union, Guards Captain G.D. Tsokolayev, who shot down several Nazi machines, became famous. Night raids were especially interesting. At night, single planes, the fleet's slow-moving MBR-2s, bombed fascist rear areas, railroad junctions, batteries and concentrations of enemy troops. Flipping through the log of combat operations, the general told us that the MBR-2s were not alone. They bombed other airplanes: P-2, I-153, I-16 and even U-2. On March 8th at night, U-2s repeatedly bombed the German rear, and on March 13th the batteries in Znamenka, which are so annoying to us. On March 19th, these U-2s bombed airfields and railway junction in Gatchina. The commander of aviation showed us a number of aerial photos of airfields and railroad junctions destroyed by our night bombers. But U-2s are small training airplanes. As a result of the conversation with General Samokhin, we made a plan of joint strikes bomb and shell on some dangerous enemy batteries. On March 26th, the Germans again intensively shelled the city and the ships. Our minesweeper OK received many shrapnel holes, but fortunately only in the surface part of the board. In my diary on that day, it is written the enemy shot at the ships. I wish the ice would melt sooner. Before we saw the spring ripples on the Neva, we still had a lot to endure. In March, after a 2-month break, enemy air scouts appeared over the city again. We had already gotten used to the sorties on the ice from Peterhof on Strelna and always successfully repelled them. The events of March 27th were of a different, more serious nature. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened at the command post by an officer on duty and reported that the enemy opened heavy artillery and mortar fire from the area of the village of Porogi on the right bank of the Neva, occupied by our troops. This is the area of Ivanovsky Porogi. There had never been shelling here before. In the headquarters of the inner defense of the city knew about this event no more than we did. Soon we received a new report from the headquarters of the Nevsky sector of coastal defense. General Kustov reported the enemy in 2 groups of 50 to 60 people under cover of their fire forced the Neva River on the ice and is attacking our observation post. Measures have been taken. The base commissar and I immediately left for the scene. On the way, I thought how good it was that according to the winter defense plan, the whole Neva was divided into combat areas headed by the commanders of the formations deployed there. Major General Kostov, an experienced Baltic artilleryman, was the head of this area. The closer to the area of the village of Porogi, the machine gun and mortar firing becomes more and more clear and sharp. The night is dark. We are quickly rushing along the snow-covered highway, but suddenly the firing stopped. Not to get in the clutches of the fascists, flashed a thought. The car turned off the highway, and we were already in the area of the sector headquarters. We were met by the Chief of Staff, Colonel Potemin. He calmly reported that all the attacks were repulsed. The enemy was in flight and hid on the left bank of the Neva. Our losses are not great. 6 sailors were wounded, and 2 machine guns were put out of action. How do you explain such insignificant losses? I was interested. The fascists were let down by their intelligence, I think. They counted on complete surprise and suddenness of their actions, and it turned out differently on the alert to the area of the sortie. Immediately, on cars arrived armed marine teams. Batteries opened fire on the ice of the Neva. Hitlerites did not expect such organized resistance, were demoralized and fled. Tell me, Colonel, how do you regard this sortie at all? I inquired. Potamin revived. Of course, it was a deep combat reconnaissance of the entire system of winter defense of Leningrad on its eastern side. Chief of Staff was right. If the reconnaissance was successful, it would certainly be followed by an attempt to force the Neva more significant forces. In this case, the enemy could cut off the city from Ladoga, completely close the ring of blockade. An attempt to break through to the city from this side, essentially from the rear, was not excluded. It was remembered that our and Kronstadt scouts have repeatedly detected the concentration of enemy infantry on the ice in the area of Sestrorodsk, Strelna and Peterhof. Again, the enemy's attempt to take us by surprise was thwarted. With a sense of deep satisfaction, we returned to Leningrad, reported to the Chief of Staff of the fleet about the night events. YF Rawl offered to review once again our plans for winter defense in the most vulnerable places in the areas of the trade port, Lisiego Nos and the village of Perogi on the Neva. In the following days, events escalated. At dawn on March 29th, the Germans began a frenzied bombardment of the area of Rozhevka Station, our batteries near the Ivanovsky Perogi, and the scientific and testing naval test site. Several heavy guns mounted there served as a strong artillery cover for Leningrad from the eastern side. But that was not the main thing. In the workshops and laboratories of the range, hundreds of women were filling and equipping shells and mines with explosives. The range was filled to the brim with explosives. We repeatedly checked the safety equipment there and all the rather complicated firefighting devices. Many workshops were surrounded by high earthen ramparts to extinguish the blast wave in case of an accident. And yet a fire at the range promised a lot of trouble. The range was part of the Leningrad Naval Base, commanded by an old, experienced Baltic artilleryman, Lieutenant General I. Esmoshnov. At about 6 a.m., he informed me by telephone that such a heavy bombardment of the area had never happened before. The shells are still falling with flights. I played the battle alarm. All the people were taken to shelters, reported the general. In his voice he sounded anxiety for his household and for hundreds of people. A few minutes later, the telephone connection with the range was interrupted. The base's chief of communications, Schwarzberg, quickly contacted a number of military and civilian institutions in the vicinity of the firing range. From there they reported that there were incredible explosions in the vicinity of the Orzhevka station. This, of course, are exploding our warehouses at the range, we decided at the command post, and again rushed to the eastern sector of defence. The Chief of Staff was ordered to send there all the fire departments and ambulances of the base. At the crossroads, a slight delay. A few trucks with fighters are allowed to pass. Is it really again the reflection of the landing across the Neva? Another turn, and in front of us stood a huge glow, and soon flames and columns of smoke became visible. The rumble of our batteries, which opened fire, merged with the close bursts of enemy shells. In this familiar artillery symphony, periodically burst into this familiar to us long rumblings of some formidable explosions. The highway is strewn with burnt planks. We could not approach the station Orzhevka. The hot incandescent air smelled of some suffocating gas. Smoke covered everything. We had to go back and approach the polygon by a roundabout way from the side of Vsevolozhskaya station. Fortunately, I could see that nothing was burning at the landfill. Small fires were liquidated in time, but many of the one-story buildings of the range are destroyed. The wounded are being brought to the sanitary unit. There are many of them, apparently several dozens. 3 soldiers killed. One 356mm gun was put out of action by enemy shells. All the evil, it turns out, was coming from here. A train with ammunition for the front had arrived at Rajevka station from Lake Ladoga the day before. The train was not unloaded at once, and when the Germans started shelling, some of the cars were blown up by shells. Neighbouring wagons also began to blow up. It was impossible to come closer than a kilometre to the exploding train because of the heat and shell fragments, car parts and blocks of frozen ground flying in all directions. It seemed that the ground was burning underfoot. At a distance of 2 kilometres around, the roofs of all the houses were blown off, windows were broken, and doors were torn off. On the pine trees of the nearby forest we found wagon wheels, pieces of locomotive parts. 20 fires in the nearest village merged into one general ominous sea of fire. All the station buildings were in flames. Almost all the fire departments of the town came to the scene, and the troops were also called in. There was no water in the local water supply system, which made the fight against the fire more difficult. The soldiers who arrived at the fire showed miracles of bravery. Many wagons were rolled back manually, saving the ammunition so necessary for the front. The whole day was fighting with fire, and only by evening the fires were extinguished. There were many dead and wounded. Hundreds of people were left homeless. It was hard on the soul when we, with the Commissar A.A. Matushkin, returned to the headquarters. The thought was drilling my head could not immediately upon the arrival of the train with ammunition to disperse the cars. All the more it was necessary to start unloading the wagons immediately. A hard lesson. The first blockade spring brought us many more unhappy events. Trying to destroy our ships while they were standing in the ice, the Germans undertook new air raids. We had to endure a serious test on April 4th. Already in the morning shells were bursting in the city, fires broke out in some places. Our batteries answered, the cannonade was growing. This time the enemy poured all the fire on the Neva, in the areas where the ships were parked. Around 7 p.m., when I returned from the fleet headquarters along the embankment to his command post in the Admiralty, the ships standing in the Neva suddenly sounded alarming signals. All the powerful loudspeakers on the crossroads of Vasilievsky Island at once boomed air alarm. Almost at the same minute someone on the panel shouted bomb. And we distinctly heard its nasty whistle. A high ice sultan rose up on the Neva at the place where the bomb had fallen. The anti-aircraft guns rumbled on the shore and on the ships. We jumped out of the car and saw 8 or 10 Junkers, 88, flying along the river from the east, slowly descending. A little farther away and closer to the left bank of the river was another group of enemy airplanes. In the distance behind each of these groups could be seen in the air still small moving dots. Such a big raid on Leningrad had not happened for a long time. The anti-aircraft guns were blasting. The sky was dotted with white baskets of bursts, between which, without changing their course, the Nazi planes were coming. In the crowd on the embankment someone shouted, "Look, look! They dive, bastards, on the cruiser Kirov." And indeed Nazi planes in groups of 6 to 10 Junkers were dive-bombing the cruiser, as well as the battleship October Revolution and destroyers standing near Vasilievsky Island. Strong explosions followed one after another at regular intervals. The sharp sounds of heavy enemy shells burst into the bomb bursts. 6 of our batteries were already firing back at the enemy. The rumble of the cannonade drowned out words. Bombs began to burst near the left bank. This did not embarrass the boys, like sparrows dotting the embankments. They got used to a lot of things during the hard days of the blockade. Not a single incident in the city was without them. Looking back towards the Admiralty, I saw a new group of enemy planes. One after another they were dive-bombing the Polar Star and the submarines along the left bank. Again, strong explosions one after another. The ground shook under my feet. Ice icicles flew from the roofs. The fascists bombed badly. Most of the bombs fell on the shore. The raid of fascist aviation lasted more than an hour. The air alert was cancelled only after 20 o'clock, but our patrol fighters were still in the air for a long time. I rushed to my command post. In an hour or two everything was sorted out. The city suffered the most. On the Neva embankment in a number of places fires were burning, multi-story houses were destroyed. But the ships, battleship, cruiser Maxim Gorky, destroyers, submarines, auxiliary fleet had only minor damage from shrapnel of bombs and shells that exploded close to them and completely preserved their fighting ability. The cruiser Kirov, our common favourite, the flagship of the squadron, received one bomb. It broke through the upper deck and the outer board at the waterline. It exploded in the water under the ice, and the cruiser remained operational. Many small bombs hit the west wing of the Admiralty. The enemy, in fact, did not achieve any combat success. Our pilots shot down on the approaches to the Neva and to the ship's 18 airplanes out of 40 flying. Until deep into the night, there were negotiations by phone, clarified all the circumstances of the raid, its consequences. Failure of the enemy operation made us expect its repetition. About this on the phone, all warned the commander of the fleet Vice Admiral Tributes, and always calm, Commander of Aviation, General Samokin, saying goodbye to me, advised. Today, Admiral, better sleep at the command post. And indeed, many flagships did not sleep that night. Everyone was waiting for the raid. Our fears were justified. At 2:00 in the morning on April 5th sounded the air alarm. The darkness was cut through by searchlight beams. The night silence was interrupted by coastal anti-aircraft guns. For a long time, the fascists kept us in suspense. For 2 hours, the bombs fell mainly on the ice of the Neva. This time, the ships were not even hit by shrapnel. No military installations were damaged. There were neither wounded nor killed. And in the morning, as soon as the darkness cleared, again began heavy shelling of factories and the Neva. German scouts, who flew in the afternoon to see the results of the raid, were driven away by our anti-aircraft gunners and fighters. Shelling of the city continued every day with unrelenting intensity. We, of course, responded vigorously. The Germans were silent for 15 to 20 minutes, apparently waiting for the inhabitants to come out of their shelters, after which they opened fire again with the same force. And so it was for 18 hours in a row. The shells began to hit the base facilities and ships more and more often. Thus, on April 14th, during the next bombardment of the Research Marine Artillery range in Rozhevka, the command post of the air defence was destroyed. At the same time, fascists shelled the Kronstadt fortress. Strong destructions were caused to Kronstadt on April 19th. A lot of houses were destroyed in the city, the naval shipyard was damaged, ships in harbours and batteries on forts were damaged. All this, of course, was not without casualties. On April 20th, during the next bombardment of the fleet in Leningrad, one 152mm shell hit the minesweeper OK, penetrated 3 decks, partially destroyed living quarters. This ship had been awarded the rank of guardship just a few days before for its courageous combat performance. A lot of shrapnel holes in the surface and superstructures received then destroyers Scary and Angry. Our fighters during the day covered the fleet from enemy air raids, but of course they could not do anything against artillery fire. In addition, almost all the fleet airfields by April 10th melted, and planes could not rise to strike at enemy batteries. A hard spring period came. The movement of ski patrols ceased. There was already a lot of water on the Neva and on the bay. General Samokin grumbled that's when they stopped flying, so everyone immediately needed aviation, and reconnaissance, and look after the channel, and hit the batteries, and cover the fleet. Now, you will know what it means to live without aviation. And indeed, without aviation it was like without hands. Only on April 20th the long-awaited general ice movement began. All ice roads to Kronstadt were closed. On April 23rd, the Neva River was cleared of ice, and we immediately distributed tugs to warships to begin the next day to rearrange the ships. It was not so easy to do this, for the shore ice was still very strong and clung to the ships as if unwilling to part with them. Sailing westward into the sea, the ice floes gave us an unexpected farewell salute. On the morning of April 23rd, a phone call from the fleet headquarters. The commander ordered to report immediately what these explosions on the bay. Do you hear them? At the command post, do not hear explosions. What's the matter? No Nazi aircraft in the air, no shelling of the city yet. And only from the battery of the rowing port reported that they could not see anything on the ice, but clearly hear random explosions for an hour in the direction of Kanonersky Island, as if sometimes the ice is blowing up too. All started in all directions. Who's shooting? Who's blowing up the ice? It turned out that it was the ice front that was saluting us, sailing westward. During the day, due to the ice movement, more than 250 mines of the Army field model, set by sappers on the ice in the fall, exploded. The explosions continued all day long. We still did not have time to move the ships. Immediately after lunch, the air alarm sounded. The day was overcast, damp, clouds were hanging low over the Neva. It is difficult for our pilots in such weather. All hope for anti-aircraft gunners. And indeed, the 9th Anti-Aircraft Regiment of Air Defense of the Leningrad Naval Base again showed high combat skill of their calculations. This regiment, commanded by Major Mukhamatov, covered ships and bridges on the Neva with its fire. We have not yet seen anything in the sky, and anti-aircraft guns have already opened fire. Hitlerites, with their inherent pattern, almost exactly repeated the previous scheme of the raid. Apparently they were in a hurry, realizing that the fleet was about to sail away. According to the air defense of the city, this time flew 159 Junkers and Messerschmitts, but only 18 bombers broke through to the fleet. On the approaches to the city, 24 airplanes were shot down, the rest turned away somewhere. The raid lasted this time 3 hours, of course, accompanied by shelling. In pairs and singly, fascist bombers were diving out of the clouds. Dozens of shrapnel holes in the sides. As before, received very many ships. There were killed and wounded. The commander of the cruiser Maxim Gorky, Captain First Rank and Petrov, told after the raid that near the ship burst 15 bombs and 100 heavy shells. After counted 300 shrapnel holes. 4 sailors were killed, 8 were wounded. Again, our guard's minesweeper OK was unlucky. This time 3 203mm shells hit the ship. The mine-feeding system was destroyed, 1 gun was smashed, and large fires broke out. As at the beginning of the month, the Germans paid special attention to the cruiser Kirov. They managed to hit the aft part of the ship with 2 100-kilogram bombs. 2 anti-aircraft batteries of the cruiser with all gun crews were destroyed. Shortly after the start of the raid, we were informed the fleet headquarters is on fire. From another place, reported fleet headquarters destroyed. Upon inspection, it turned out that the building of the Naval Academy, where the fleet headquarters was located, was indeed hit. Almost one after another, 6 small bombs, most of them in the courtyard, where several cars were burned. Of course, all the glass in the building was blown out. There was no way the Nazis wanted to let us out to sea. On April 25th and 27th, they repeated their air raids again, accompanying them with artillery fire. But the enemy's forces were melting. In the first raid involved 55 aircraft, of which we shot down 6, and in the second raid only 24 Junkers. Again, dozens of shrapnel holes, but this time mainly in the auxiliary ships. Apparently the fleet and coastal anti-aircraft gunners knocked off the combat course of the Nazis, and they threw bombs anywhere. Hitler's order to destroy the Baltic fleet in the Neva remained, thus unfulfilled, as well as many of his other delusions. The last grey and dirty heavy ice floes sailed westward. Leningrad, together with its brainchild, the Baltic fleet, had survived the first blockade winter. Breathing in the invigorating spring wind from the sea, the Baltic sailors were preparing for new battles at sea and on land.